Okay, Tov. Today's daf is daf Nun Hey, and we'll start with the Mishnah. And this Mishnah is going to quote and record certain testimonies of Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgida. And these all have to do with either Takonas Chachamim or perhaps dinim that were quoted in the Mishnah. Hey, Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgida al-Chayreshes. Now we know that a cheresh showed to the katan lav bar deya ninhu she ua avia. When she was a ketana, her father married her off, and the father's kiddushin is chal da'oraisa, just like in the case of a ketana, so too in the case of a chereshes, and this despite the fact that she has no das. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgida testifies shehi yotza beget, that if you give her a get, then the gerushin is chal. Why? After all, she doesn't have any das to accept the gerushin, but the answer is that get is afilu bal karcha. With regard to gerushin, we only need the das of the megarish, we don't need the das of the misgareshes, and therefore chereshes, despite the fact that she has no das, she can be misgareshes. The issue here would be v'shilcha mibeso. Does v'shilcha mibeso apply to a chereshes? For example, in the case of a shota, the Gemara establishes in Masechet Yevamos that she's meshalcha v'chozeres, so there's no v'gerash v'shilcha mibeso. And we would think that in the case of chereshes, likewise, like a shota, she has no das, she cannot be megarisha. So the Tosas Rid and others suggest that there's a difference between chereshes and a shota. And just like in the case of a ketana, you can train her to understand that she doesn't go back to her husband after she receives the get. So too in the case of chereshes, she's not like a shota, and she can understand, and she'll be mishalcha v'ena chozeres. Furthermore, Rabbi Yochanan testifies al haktana bas Yisrael. Now we're talking here about kiddushin d'Rabbanan, which means that her father died, and her brother or her mother received kiddushin on her behalf. That's called kiddushay ketana. Shenises lekohen, if her kiddusha was to a kohen, then she can eat truma, but only truma d'Rabbanan. Ochel is truma, but truma means truma d'Rabbanan. Rabbanan, since this kiddushin is not valid d'oraisa, cannot allow her to eat truma d'oraisa. But heimamru v'heimamru, they established truma d'Rabbanan, like for example, truma b'zman hazeh, or truma sirakos or kitnios, and that she can eat. Via mesa. Now, if this ketana dies, according to the Torah law, her close relatives would inherit her. But the Rabbanan made a takana in order to encourage this marriage, that Baila Yorsha, that he will have the schus of Yerusha. A third testimony of Rabbi Yochanan, Vial HaMorish. Morish is a beam, a large wooden beam that's used for a roof. Hagazlan, it was stolen. Shebno Bibira, and the Gazlan built this into a building. Sheyitol es damav. In this case, the takana was made that the Gazlan does not have to take apart the entire roof of his house, because that would discourage him from coming forward to confess his sin. He doesn't want to take apart his house. And therefore, they allowed him to just pay the worth in cash of the marsh. And finally, the fourth testimony of Rabbi Yochanan, recorded in our Mishnah, is Be'al Behemas Chatos Hagzula. So a man stole an animal, and then the Gazlan was Magdish Chatos, and the takana was made that even, let's say he wasn't Kona, I'm going to go now according to one shita, the shita of Ula, that yesh b'chti lo kani, meaning that even though the nigzal declared vayli l'chisaron kiss, he despaired of getting back his behema gzula, but nevertheless, the gazlan does not acquire ownership on it. And with regard to a carbon, the carbon has to be possessed by the bala carbon, and the gazlan is not the bailim of the carbon. Nevertheless, the Mishnah establishes takana, I guess based on hefker bezin hefker, that the carbon is valid. When? In a case of shalom nodol l'rabbi. And this is all mipnei tikkun olam. Now, why the kapara is contingent on lo nodol l'rabbi is something that we'll pick up in the Gemara. But again, keep in mind that I only interpreted this Mishnah in the light of Ula Shita, that yesh b'chti lo kani. We'll see the dissenting opinion of Yehuda, who says yesh b'chti kani, and therefore on the Doraisa level, the carbon of the gazlan is mechaperes. But on contrary, the Rabbanan are going to say that if no dolarabim, the carbon is not mechaper, as we'll soon see. Amar Rav Meidusas Rabbi Yochanan ben Guda, from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan ben Guda testifies that even if the Kiddushin are full-fledged Kiddushin, like in the case of a father who received Kiddushin for his bas hachereshes, nevertheless, with Gerishin, she doesn't need das. And from that, says Rava, we could jump to another conclusion, and that is that Omerli Eidim, if the Baal tells the witnesses, Re'u get zeshani nosein la, I am about to give this woman, my wife, a get. And then when he gets close to her, instead of saying, I'm giving you a get, hareze giteh, chazav yomar, kinsi shtarchov zeh, I have a shtarchov for you that you'll be able to collect from someone a debt. It's not a get. And says Rav, okay, she doesn't know it's a get. Obviously, she has no das and rotzon to be miskareshes, but hareze megureshes, the get is chal, because Rabbi Yochanan Gudgid has already testified that we don't need her das with regard to gerish. Of course, the obvious question on this Gemara is that it wasn't Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgida who was machadish this chiddush that our isha miskareshes bal karcha. He only pointed out that in the case of chareshes, she's a mashalcha v'ena choseres. In any event, we are now in a bind, because on the one hand, the husband indicated to the Edom that he wants this to be a get. On the other hand, he said to her, Kinsi shtarchov zeh. Did he change his mind? Milo Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgida de lo be'ina and shlo b'inin daita hachinami lo b'inin daita. So Gemara says pshita. Obviously, if in the case of chereshes she's miskareshes shlo midaita, in the case of pikachas, when he fools her by telling her it's a shtarchov, obviously she's megureshes. We don't need a das. So what was the chiddush of Rav? Ma'al the time I would have thought without Rav. The cave on the Omar Kinsi Shtarchov Zebituli Batle, we learned already early in the Masechet, the Baal could be Mavatal the get. And if he does so, he removes the Lishma of the get becomes possible. And you cannot be Megarish with this get. Now that he's saying Kinsi Shtarchov Zeh, I would have thought, if not for Rava, that he's making a declaration that I'm being Mavatal the get, and it's no longer a get in my eyes. It's now a Shtarchov. Kamash Malan, no. We have a proof to establish that he wasn't choser, but he wasn't coming to be mevatel to get him isa the vatli. If he would have come to mevatli, then he would have turned to the edim, and havi amalahu, he would have said to the edim, "This is not a get." So why did he tell his wife that's a shtarchov mishum kisufa? He was embarrassed to tell her that he's divorcing. The Mishnah establishes al Ketana Bas Yisrael Nisais Lekoin Ochels Petruma Derabanan, and the Gemara is medayik Rabbi Yochanan ben Gittin, in his opening statement, addressed the case of a chayreshes. In his next statement, he addressed the case of a ketana. Why did he make that switch? Ve'ilu chayreshes lo achla. He implies that only a ketana who is married to a kohen is allowed to eat truma d'Rabbanan, but not a chayreshes, because if he held that even a chayreshes would be allowed to eat truma d'Rabbanan, he should have stuck to chayreshes. Right? Liflog v'lisne v'didah, as we always say. So now the Gemara wants to say, okay, your diak is excellent, but my timer, what's the logical distinction between a ketana who's married to a kohen and she's allowed to eat truma d'Rabbanan, as opposed to chayreshes married to a kohen and she's not allowed to eat truma d'Rabbanan? Why not? And the Gemara answers, gzeira shemiyachil cheresh b'chereshes. Now, the Gemara establishes the following gzeira. If we allow a pikeach who marries a chayreshes to feed his wife truma d'Rabbanan, then in the case of a cheresh who married a chayreshes, likewise he would be tempted to understand that she's allowed to, he could be machil or truma d'Rabbanan. V'lechol. So the Gemara says, what's the big deal? At the end of the day, she's a chayreshes. And if she's a chayreshes, then she doesn't have taryag mitzvahs, and it should be like a katan ochel nevela su. And we have a sugya Masechet Yevamos that if we see a katan eating nevela, ein bezdim mitzuvin lafrisha, and therefore let her eat even truma d'oraisa for my part. She's a chayreshes, and ein bezdim mitzuvin lafrisha. So it would seem that at this point in the Gemara assumes that even in the case of a ketana, meaning if a ketana is married to a kohen and the Mishnah says she's allowed to eat truma, the Gemara is now not differentiating between truma d'oraisa and truma d'Rabbanan. And the reason for that is kat nochel nevelos ein bezdim mitzuvin lafrisha. And now the Gemara is bothered, why not apply the same yardstick to the case of a chayreshes? So the Gemara says, "V'lechol b'truma d'Rabbanan." I'm sorry, I skipped. Gzeira shemiyachil cheresh b'pikachas. In the case of a cheresh and nasa chereshes, if we're going to allow her to eat truma, then that's going to be confused with the case of a cheresh who married a pikachas. Meaning, we would think that a cheresh can effectuate kiddushay Torah, and he can be machil truma, and even to a pikachas. What difference does it make? If he can be machil truma to a chereshes, then he can be machil to a pikachas. And this is a problem, because cheresh is a labardas, and his kiddushin is not a doraisa, is not recognized by the Torah, because he's lacking das. And it's only b'Rabbanan that his kiddushin are valid, and therefore he cannot be machil ha truma doraisa. So they made a gizera now in the case of pikeach shenasa chereshes, even though we shouldn't have any problem with her eating truma, or to a case of cheresh shenasa chereshes. And what's the problem with cheresh shenasa chereshes? That's gizera mishum cheresh shenasa pikachas. And if pikachas would eat truma, and on a doraisa level she's not married to a kohen because the Torah doesn't recognize marriage to a cheresh, then she's violating an isur zaris l'truma, which is a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. So the Gemara says, "V'lecho b'truma d'Rabbanan chach." Okay, if a cheresh marries a pikachas, I admit that she cannot eat truma doraisa, but let her at least eat truma d'Rabbanan, because the kiddushin of a cheresh is valid midrabbanan. So let's apply the principle of Hey Omru to permit her to eat truma d'Rabbanan. And from our diuk, that Rabbi Yochanan Gudgada only spoke about a ketana who's married to a Kohen is allowed to eat truma, implying that a chereshes who's married to a Kohen is not allowed to eat truma. Why not allow it to eat truma d'Rabbanan? And so too, in the case of a cheresh nasa bikachas, allow her to eat truma d'Rabbanan. The Gemara answers gzeira shema asi lachule truma d'oraisa. Once this truma floating around here in the kitchen, and she's eating truma d'Rabbanan, she might come to eat truma d'oraisa. And that's a fear in the case of cheresh nasa bikachas, because she's asur ben Torah, bidin zarus, to eat from truma d'oraisa. However, in the case of ketana, when she was married off to a Kohen, she's allowed to eat truma d'Rabbanan. Why? Because there's no room for gzeira here. Or to a katan. Right? We said in the case of chereshes, there's a gzeira or to a cheresh. But there cannot be such a parallel gzeira in the case of a ketana or to a katan, because if a katan marries a woman, then it's not even kiddushay d'Rabbanan. What I don't understand here, and I looked for an answer to this question, didn't find one, maybe you have one, is in the case of a ketana, why aren't we afraid that she'll eat truma d'oraisa? So I guess the answer to that question probably is the Gemara in Yevamos of kat nochel nevelos ein bez mitzvah lafrisha. But in the case we're afraid of a cheresh and nasa pikachas, there we certainly have to worry about truma d'oraisa to the pikachas who's a zar. The Mishnah tells us ala morish hagozel shebna'o is all he pays is damim ton rabbanon. We learned in a brayso so that there's a machlokes tanoim about this very point. Gazal morish ubno babir beit Shammai omer mekaka. According to Beit Shammai, we can force the gazla mekakeh to take apart his roof piece by piece, beam by beam. As kol habira kula umachzer samorish lebala. They saw omrim elo elod made morish bulvad mishum takonas hashovim. It was Beit Shammai who accepted the position at takonas hashovim that if we make it so impossible for the gazlan to return the gzela, namely he has to take apart his whole house, he'll be inhibited from confessing his gzela. Mishnah says al chatos hagzula. If it's lo no dollar rabim, it's mechaperes, and that's called tikkun mizbeach. And now the Gemara is going to clarify this whole concept called tikkun mizbeach and what situation we talk about. Omer ula, tvar Torah, according to the Torah law, bein noda, bein lo noda, eina mechaperes. Why taima yesh bichdi lo kani? Ula holds that a gazlan does not have ownership over the chayfetz hanigzal, even after the nigzal has declared his yesh. And the reason for this is because yesh b'chdi lo kani. You would need yesh plus shinu rishus. If let's say the gazlan after the yesh of the nigzal would pass it on to a third party. That's not our case. In our case, where the gazlan himself is bringing the carbon, and it's not his carbon to bring, and therefore says ula lo eina mechaperes, according to Torah law, eina mechaperes. But now it's saying that if it was a case of lo noda l'rabim, it is mechaperes. Matam omru. What is this whole business about tikkun mizbeach? Lo noda. If the gzela is not known, is mechaperes, the Rabbanon through Hefka Bez Nefka are going to allow this carbon to go through. And the answer is Shalo Yu HaKohanim Atsev. If we find out after the Kohen ate from the basar chatos, that lo and behold, that behema was a behema gzula, and it wasn't within the purview, the rights of the Gazel, to be the Baal Korban, to bring the carbon, and therefore it's Chulin Lazara. And the Kohanim have eaten Chulin Bazara, that's going to make them very, very sad and very inhibited about doing the Avodah. So we're going to keep this thing hush-hush. No one has to know, and certainly not the Kohanim, that this carbon chatos on a doraisa level could not be mechaperes because it's a stolen behemoth. And yesh b'chdilo kanim. Keep that information classified. Amri lei Rabban Le'ula v'anan mifnei tikun mizbeach. How are you going to fit your words that you're worried about the Kohen becoming atzuv into the words of the Mishnah of Tikkun Mizbeach? This is not Tikkun Mizbeach. This is only so that the Kohanim shouldn't be Atzuvim. Amalehem, ulasek Kohanim Atzuvim. If the Kohanim would be Atzuvim, because we would notify them, lo and behold, against all of their assumptions that they were eating Chulin Bazara, Nimsa Mizbeach Batel. Who's going to want to serve on the Mizbeach? The Kohanim are so inhibited and so worried about violating an Isur Kares of Chulin Bazara, they're not going to even want to get involved. I don't want to get involved. Rav Yehuda Amar, Rav Yehuda holds that what? Yesh b'chli kanim. Ubein shenoda, bein shelo noda on a doraisa level mechaperes. Why? Because there was yesh violence. And my time yesh kedi kani, a gazlan could be kona the gzela with yesh. And once he does so, he could bring a carbon. So who cares? No, the lonan, it makes no difference. The carbon is kosher. And now what we have to do is we have to understand why the Mishnah says that in the case of lonoda, mechaperes, the Rabbanan made a takon.